Good evening. Welcome on a wet February to St Matthew's. My name's Howard Kellett. I'm one of the partners with Richard who've putting on these Rethinks events. This is the 6th Rethink event and the second one we've done together. The aim of Rethink is to take issues that are in the cultural domain, take issues that there's lots of argument and opinion around, and to try and address them with an open hand and bring different perspectives. But as you'll guess, because we're in a church, there will be a Christian perspective. It won't be in the form of a sermon, I don't suspect, although John may lead us that way. It won't be in the form of a sermon. It'll be in the form of saying that this is a reasoned response to some of the issues that we're talking about this evening. And then there'll be a chance for questions. There are no questions that I'm sure Richard will tell you about how to do questions. No questions that are off limits. You're not trying to please the rector or anybody with your Christian questions. You can bring any questions, and I'm sure John will be happy to answer those. So that's what we're doing. So you're really, really welcome, whether it's your first time to Rethink, or if you come again, if you've been a number of times. It was very nice for me. I got an email today from Eventbrite saying, you have a lot of returning customers. So really well done for coming again a second time, and we'll tell you about the next Rethink coming up in a moment. So I'll just hand over to Richard, and then we'll go.
Great, thanks Howard very much. I'm Richard Coombs, I'm the rector of the church here, and I'd like to add my welcome to Howard's. Just to say that if we need to evacuate quickly, there are 3 exits, one through the door over there, one through this door here, and the other through the way you came in. And there are toilets right at the back of the building or through the door on the right. If you need those, do feel free to use them at any point during the evening. Now, we're so fortunate tonight to have Professor John Wyatt as our Rethink speaker. I'm going to have to read this out because I'm going to get it wrong, but John is the Emeritus Professor of Neonatal Pediatrics, Ethics and Perinatology. Have I got that right? At University College London. He's a consultant paediatrician, caring for sick and premature infants. He's an academic researcher, and he is a specialist in medical ethics. He's frequently engaged in public and professional consultations and debates about medical ethics from the perspective of the Christian faith, and has given evidence in the Houses of Parliament as an expert witness. There are a couple of books which are on our bookstall tonight: The Right to Die, Euthanasia, Assisted Suicide, and End of Life Care, and Dying Well, but that's just 2 of a number of books that he has authored. So he is really, really well qualified to speak on this subject of the right to die tonight. The way the evening is going to work is that John will speak for about 30-35 minutes, then we'll have a short break, and then he will answer some questions from the floor. Now, to do the questions, we're going to use an app called Slido. Do many of you know Slido? Shall we just put up the Slido slide? You need to click onto the Slido slide. That will take you directly to the Slido app. And when you're in the app, you can type your question. You can do it with a name, or you can do it anonymously, or you can vote for somebody else's question, which is a very good way of doing it, because that means that we can get an idea of the sort of questions that people are asking. And you can type in your question at any point during the talk, so don't feel you have to wait to the end. After the talk, there'll be about just a 5-minute break while John and I have a look at the questions and decide which ones we're going to answer. We may not be able to answer all of them. I will take just a few questions from the floor, because I know some people hate this sort of thing and would much rather just ask a question from the floor. So I will ask you to put up a hand, and we'll have a roving mic to ask a question in that way. The last thing I just want to say is that we are so aware that this is a really sensitive subject, and for many of you, you may have lost loved ones recently, you may have lost loved ones in horrible circumstances, and this evening may trigger things for you. We would love to point you in the direction of help, if that would be appropriate for you. So do feel free at the end to come and talk to me, or to John, or to Howard, and we'd be very, very happy to talk to you or to point you in the right direction where you can find some help and support. So, without further ado, Professor John Wyatt.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. As you've heard, we're tackling some really difficult subjects. We're talking about death and suffering and suicide. It's going to be a bundle of laughs. But seriously, as Richard has said, we realize this is a really painful and difficult topic. And, you know, there are some fascinating philosophical, social, theological issues here. But it's really important to remember, first of all, to recognize the pain and the suffering that these topics represent. I've come to the conclusion that really virtually all issues of medical ethics start with human pain. They start with people who struggle and suffer and are filled with anxiety. And our first responsibility, therefore, as fellow human beings and those of you who are Christian believers, our first responsibility is to empathize, to enter into the pain, to recognize, rather than engage in rhetoric. And sometimes it distresses me that the public voice that we hear so often on the media of people arguing about these desperately complex life and death issues, we hear these sort of rhetorical, sort of people lobbing grenades at one another with harsh and really inappropriate rhetoric. And so I hope we can avoid that. And as I said, the first thing we need to recognize is the pain, the suffering that is represented. Secondly, as has already been said, these are not issues just out there in society, out there in Cheltenham. These are issues in here, in this room, because many people here will have watched a loved one die, sometimes in really quite painful circumstances, or you may yourself know that you have a terminal condition. This could be very close to home, and you're wondering what the future is going to bring. You're wondering how we're going to die. In fact, all of us are going to die. And I wrote a book called Dying Well, which is available at the end. And I found myself, as I was writing that book, thinking, I wonder how I'm going to die. If you write a book called Dying Well, you really are putting the stakes up rather high. How am I going to die? Who will be there? What's going to happen to me? So this is something that touches all of us. It's part of our humanity. And a philosopher of the French Enlightenment said, death, like the sun, should not be stared at. But actually, that's what we are going to do. We're going to stare at death and think about it. And of course, this is a topic which is very current at the moment. As you know, a bill with really very profound implications for the first time ever in the history of the UK, to allow doctors to plan how to kill patients and how to help them end their lives. That bill is passing through Parliament. It's currently at a committee stage. It's passed through the most important stage, a vote in the House of Commons, and it's very likely that it will become law. And the implications are going to be huge if that's the case. It's going to have untold implications, I think, throughout the National Health Service, for health practitioners, for all of us. And we can come back to that. So why is it that changing the law to allow doctors to help people to kill themselves, why is it that this seems to be astonishingly popular? In surveys of the British public, up to 80% of the British public, when polled, say that they are in favour of changing the law to help so doctors can assist people dying. The problem, of course, is that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that a lot of people in the general public just don't understand what is being proposed. For instance, it's a common myth that doctors are legally obliged to give every possible treatment, and that's just not true. Doctors, ever since the history of medicine, doctors right back hundreds of years, doctors have regarded it as entirely appropriate that there is a time to say enough is enough. There's a time to stop medical treatment, even if it's keeping people alive. So what is being proposed is something quite different. What is being proposed is that doctors should have a double O prefix like James Bond, license to kill. You know, at the moment, doctors working in every aspect of medicine are covered by exactly the same law as everybody else. And I personally find that very comforting. We're not allowed to kill any more than anyone else is. We're governed by exactly the same legal statutes. What is being proposed is to put doctors in a special category. That under certain circumstances, once the process has been approved, the doctor can now use their skill and medical training actually to kill people or to help them kill themselves. So why is it that this seems to be astonishingly popular? Why have attitudes changed? Certainly if you were to go back even 20, 30 years ago, you would find a strong majority of the population were against this. A strong majority would say suicide is not a good way to die, and we shouldn't be helping people to kill themselves. Why is it that attitudes have changed? Well, I think we can identify a number of key changes in public attitudes. And perhaps the most important is the rise of what philosophers call autonomy. It's a Greek word, autonomos. It basically means, to put it crudely, I make my own laws. The right of self-rule. And autonomy, the individual autonomy, the idea that each one of us has the right to make our own rules, to choose our own way, to go the way we wish, irrespective of what other people think. That is an idea which is an ancient idea. It goes back hundreds of years. But in the last 20, 30 years, it has become the received wisdom. The right to choose, the right to direct my own life. I'm told that the commonest music, I wonder if you could guess, what do you think is the commonest music that is requested at funerals? I do it my way. Isn't that interesting? What does that say about whatever happened, I did it my way? That's the most important thing. So autonomy, individualism is, I think, is the number one factor in the change of attitudes. A second one, which is closely related to that, is the idea of materialism. The idea that actually there's nothing, the human body is simply composed of chemicals, and when we're alive, the chemicals are whizzing around in a particular way, and when we die, well, those chemicals just go into the earth and they're lost, and you just go out like a candle. That's what death is. Death is nothing at all. And that idea of being snuffed out, again, interestingly, that's quite a new idea. It's always been around. Philosophically, you can trace it all the way back thousands of years before the time of Christ. But as a commonly accepted philosophy, that was pretty unusual. And in fact, working as a doctor over many years, trying to discuss the possible death of a patient or of a child, sometimes because I worked as a pediatrician, it's interesting how in the past, using the kind of language of, well, the body is like the shell, and when you die, the shell goes into the earth, but the person It's still there. The person has escaped. You know, it was something like a chrysalis and a butterfly, like the acorn going into the ground, the seed coming. These were the common narratives which people in our society used. But now, those, although they're still there, they're less common. Now the idea is you just go out like a light. There's nothing beyond. Science has proved it. Really? It certainly hasn't. So it's interesting then, related to that, is that suffering, unpleasant things, are seen increasingly as pointless, futile, even dehumanizing. Not just pain, agony, even struggle, unpleasant things, all of that is just pointless. Eradicate it, get rid of it. It's interesting that that attitude is very common, except when you come to the gym. When you come to the gym, everybody knows no pain, no gain. You've got to feel the burn. You know, everybody knows that, but in the rest of life, pain is pointless, meaningless, dehumanizing. You just get rid of it. It has no value. And not surprisingly then, if I was to ask you what would be your preferred way to die, if you could dial up your ideal death, how would you like to die? What do you think is the commonest answer that people would say to that question? I want to die in my bed at night. I want no warning, no premonition. I'm absolutely fine. I go to bed and poof, I've gone. How wonderful. I can see you all smiling. How wonderful. What a great way to die. You know, it's really interesting. If you were to go back 300 or 400 years, sudden, unexpected death like that was regarded as the worst possible way to die. In fact, there's a collect in the Church of England which prays specifically against from sudden death, good Lord, preserve us. To just go out with no warning, no chance to say goodbye to your loved ones, no chance to pass on something of value, no chance to ask for forgiveness where you've done evil things, no chance to prepare to meet your maker, no chance to repair damaged relationships, to say those last words to your loved ones, just to go out like what a terrible way to die. So isn't it interesting that what was seen as the most terrible way to die is now seen as the ideal? How did that happen? Why should sudden death be seen as so wonderful? But I think it's because to be honest, if I was being brutally honest, it just shows the level of narcissism and self-regard which is common in our community. In other words, we're not really thinking about other people. We're not really thinking about whoever's going to come into your bedroom and find this cold corpse in your bed. We're not really thinking about the impact on other people. All we're thinking about is ourselves, our precious little selves, and so nothing at all unpleasant should happen to us. And that's really just an extraordinary level of narcissism, of self-centeredness. My father died suddenly, and it still hurts me that I never had that chance to say how much I loved him. I never had the chance to say goodbye. I never had the chance to have that final conversation. He was just gone. One day he was there, and the next day he was gone. So sudden death can actually have devastating effects on many people. And to say that is the ideal way to die, again, just reflects changes in our society. A final issue, I think, is that death has become very medicalized. In the old days, the commonest place where death happened was at home, in your own home, surrounded by your loved ones. Everybody was there. Everybody would see you as you were dying. The children were there. All the generations, they would be there around the bedside. And death was a common experience. I mean, just think about Charles Dickens' novels. Every single Dickens novel has a sort of prolonged deathbed scene, because that's what Victorian era was like. Everybody had watched children die. Everybody had watched adults, young adults, old adults. It was just part of society. Now, death has become medicalized. It's a medical problem, and it's something that happens behind screens in a hospital, surrounded by anonymous professionals. And many people have never seen a dead body. Many people have never watched somebody die. And instead, death is just something to be fearful of, some horror. Of course, if your only experience of death is watching some horror films, Hollywood's version, your mind can be filled with horrific ideas of what death is actually like. And it's that medicalization. In fact, the medicalization of death is one of the reasons why people say, I can't trust the doctors. The doctors are going to be fighting, keeping me alive. The only way I can control it is by having a law which allows me to kill myself. So I think because of these social factors, a move to legalize medical killing is spreading across the world. Different forms of medical killing. In the Netherlands, doctors, the commonest way in which is doctors just inject a lethal injection. It's commonly done by your family practitioner at home. Something like 5% or more of all deaths in the Netherlands now happen by euthanasia. And there's another, more than 5% happen with something called terminal sedation, when doctors just basically put people to sleep with drugs, but don't give them any kind of fluid or food, and eventually they die of starvation or dehydration. In other countries in the world, in deliberate killing by doctors is illegal, but doctors instead can plan how to help people kill themselves. And when the doctors first started killing people, actually they didn't know how to do it. It wasn't something you got taught at medical school, you'd be interested to know. And so there were some really horrific and grisly experiments while doctors tried to work out ways of killing people quickly and cleanly. Eventually they worked out methods of using massive overdoses. So one of the commonest methods is to use a 50 times overdose of an old-fashioned drug called barbiturates, coupled with other drugs which are designed to stop people struggling on a mechanical ventilator, which paralyze the muscles temporarily. If you give the combination of these drugs, it's a fairly efficient means of execution at the end of a needle. This is not normal medical care. These are not the drugs which are used in palliative care. These are actually the drugs of the anaesthetist. They're designed to kill swiftly, cleanly. And that's what's being proposed here in the UK. What's being proposed is that if someone has 6 months to live, a doctor has to certify that they have only 6 months to live. Well, you can see the problem right away. As an experienced consultant in the NHS, I have tried to predict when people are going to die many times in my life, and I've got it spectacularly wrong both ways. Sometimes I've been absolutely convinced that the patient is going to live for months, and they die the following day. Sometimes I've confidently predicted that they're on the way out, and lo and behold, they're still here 5 years later. That's what medical prognosis is like. It's not an exact science. The idea that you come along and say, I would think 5 5 months, maybe 4.5. You know, I mean, this is complete nonsense. But unfortunately, that is what's being proposed, that a literal prediction of life expectancy will come. Then you have to show that the patient is not being coerced. They have a free decision to want to kill themselves, and that they are not suffering from a mental illness. Again, how you rule out coercion in practice, how you rule out the fact that the relatives are exerting influences, expecting a doctor who may not be your normal doctor, maybe just a new doctor who you found, who's prepared to do this, expecting them to be able to assess what's really going on in the family dynamics, again, it is complex and difficult. But that's what's being proposed and is being currently discussed. And if you'd like me to talk more about the details and the political process, I'd be happy to do that in the Q&A. What are the risks if this legislation goes through? Well, I think a lot of it is blindingly obvious. This legislation is being driven by a relatively small number of people who have always controlled their life. They tend to be highly educated, very articulate. They've gone through the whole of their life exercising their own autonomy, and they are completely outraged that now they're coming to the end of their life and they've been able to control everything else about their life, and the one thing they cannot control is the time and the manner of how I die. And they think this is ridiculous. This is 2025. Why can I not choose and control my own death? But actually, you know, there are 500,000 people a year who die in the UK. And most of those hundreds of thousands of people that die are not like that. They are not the highly articulate, educated, controlling types. Many, many of them are older people who are vulnerable, who don't want to be a burden to anyone, who are open to coercion and abuse. And that's the concern. The concern is that I'm sure we would know people who we would think would be vulnerable if a nice smiling doctor came along and said, you know, have you ever thought about the possibility that we could put you out of your misery, we could just solve the problem for you? All you need to do is just sign here. And so I think that the risk there, but there are other risks as well. I'm afraid medical mistakes are common. I'm actually on the council of a professional organization which is involved in trying to deal with the consequences of medical mistakes. I act as an expert witness in legal cases. I'm all too well aware of the fact that, tragically, medical mistakes happen. Doctors are human. What are going to be the consequences when someone was killed and it turned out they didn't have cancer at all? It was just a strange kind of infection, and they could have lived for 10 years. It's a bit late now. What will be the implications? What's going to be the effect on the medical profession? Something I'm very concerned about is that if this is introduced into the NHS, even though a doctor who is really opposed to this can claim conscientious objection, most medicine these days is part of teamwork. We're all parts of big interdisciplinary teams. How can I work as a member of a team if my colleagues are arranging to kill the patients that I was looking after yesterday? Is that really possible for me? Is it something that I think is abhorrent? Can I carry on working, even if I personally don't have to do the deed? Can I carry on working? Is it going to be possible to create safe places for patients, safe places for doctors and health professionals within the NHS? So behind all this is the question is, what is a good way to die? And if you were to go back more than 2,000 years, certainly in the Greek and Roman empires and in many other cultures around the world, suicide was always regarded as a noble and an honorable way to die. But the fascinating thing is that from the time of the early Christian era, all cultures which have been influenced by Christianity have never been in favor of suicide. Suicide has always been seen as an act of despair, an act of hopelessness, an act of self-destruction, and something to be resisted. And it's interesting, if you know your Bibles, you will know that all the suicides in the Bible are never celebrated. Judas Iscariot, Saul, King Saul, who allows himself, who asked to be killed. Suicide is an act of despair and hopelessness, and yet suicidal thoughts are quite common in God's people. Elijah says, "It's enough, Lord, take my life." But God doesn't take his life. Instead, he sends him on a sabbatical. And he has to learn again that God is in control of his life and that God has more things for him to do. So suicidal thoughts are quite common in God's people. I have to be honest and say I went through a very severe psychiatric illness some years ago, and I too, my head was filled with suicidal thoughts. And I was just thinking, actually, if I could just end my life, that would just stop the suffering, and it would be great. And if someone had come along and said, "Well, here's the form, just sign here," maybe I wouldn't be here now. But by God's grace, instead of being met by that, I was met by love and compassion and care. And gradually, as my mind was restored, I realized actually the suicide, killing yourself, was not the solution. It's not the way forward. So, suicidal thoughts are common, and I'm sure there are people here who you too have been in a dark place, and you too have wondered sometimes whether the right thing to do was to end your life. But what the Christian faith says, and also what our culture has always said, is don't do it. That's why we have an enormous enterprise, all intended for suicide prevention. We have organizations like the Samaritans and many others. Every doctor, every nurse, every police officer, every social worker, we're all trained in suicide prevention. How to recognize the patient, the client who's at risk, and how to prevent it. So suicide is not a right to be assisted. It's an act of despair and hopelessness. And the reason why it is not just for the person, it's because when someone commits suicide, it has ripples and impacts throughout their family. Again, there will be people here where you tragically have watched the consequences of a loved one committing suicide. I can remember, sadly, I've just in the last few years, I've known of 4 families where a young adult committed suicide. And the devastating effect. I can remember being in a church when a young girl who was in her late teens had committed suicide. And the church was packed with 400 people. And the level of love and tears. And I was thinking, if only that poor girl could have seen how much she meant to hundreds of people. So that's why suicide is wrong. No man is an island, said John Donne. Never ask for whom the bell tolls, the funeral bell. It tolls for you. So that's why suicide is not the way. So what is the way forward? What does a good death look like? Well, thankfully, here we come to the good news. The UK actually, believe it or not, leads the world in caring for dying people. Palliative care services in the UK are the best in the world. They're not perfect. There are many inadequacies. And one of the things that many of us are hoping is that because of this greater awareness of this topic, that there's going to be greater concentration on palliative care. Palliative care was invented in the mid-1950s and 60s by a small group of pioneers, of medics. Interestingly, nearly all of them were Christians. They were Christian believers, and they believed passionately that mercy killing was wrong, but they were watching people die in a very bad way, and they said, we must work out a better way of helping people to die well. And one of them was Cicely Saunders. She was initially a Christian nurse working in central London. She was caring for dying people. She was so convinced about the need to try and do something positive that she went back and trained as a doctor. And she became an international expert on caring for dying people. And she really created a new way. One of her most important insights is that she realized that suffering at the end of life was not just physical pain. And if there's one thing I hope that you will remember from this lecture, if you don't remember anything else, could you try and remember that? Because most people really don't understand this. I think most people think that when you're dying, they hear these horrible stories of people dying and they're crying out in agony. Possibly you've watched somebody dying in a bad way and who seems so distressed. And they say, and the doctors tried to do everything they could, and they were giving large quantities of drugs, and it didn't seem to do any good at all. What Cicely Saunders realized is that pain, suffering at the end of life, is much more than physical pain. The physical pain is the easy stuff. Physical pain, like, for instance, where a cancer is pressing on nerve cells, and it causes a sort of aching, horrible, gnawing pain. That is the easy pain. We have remarkable ways of controlling physical pain, provided you're under the care of an expert who knows what they're doing. The difficult pain is the other kinds of pain, because what Cicely Saunders realized, there's physical pain, but there's also psychological pain. And psychological pain is to do with everything that's going on in my head. Is about anxiety and fear and maybe depression. Maybe I'm worrying about the impact of my illness on other people. I'm worrying what's going to happen. I'm worrying about the future. And then there's relational pain. So sadly, so many people, as they come to the end of their life, what is really causing distress is the broken relationships. For many people, I'm going to die and I'm never going to be reconciled to my loved one, to my son or my daughter. And that's the agony. And pain-killing drugs don't work very well for that kind of relational pain. And then there's spiritual pain. And spiritual pain is about guilt. Am I going to, about terrible things that I'm haunting my memory or that I've done in my life? Or maybe a sense of purposelessness. I'm coming to the end, and what's the point? So there's physical pain, there's psychological pain, there's relational pain, and there's spiritual pain. And when you hear a story of someone crying out in agony with deep distress, I can guarantee to you that is not physical pain. There's something else going on there. And what Cicely Saunders said is we need to identify what the source of the pain is, and then we can do something about it. So if it's psychological pain, well, the most important thing for psychological pain is just companionship, to have somebody there to hold your hand. But if necessary, we can provide talking therapists. If necessary, we can provide antidepressant medication or other forms of treatment. And then for relational pain, well, now here is an opportunity to heal the broken relationships. And there are wonderful stories. In fact, I've actually witnessed it myself. A friend of mine had this deeply painful and broken relationship with his father. And his father was dying. And he knew that I'd written books about dying and all the rest. And he talked to me and he said, I can't talk to my dad. We've never had a civil conversation for 20 years. What can I do? And I said, Just go and see him and put your arms around him and tell him you love him. And that's what he did. And he came back and said, we had the most amazing time. For the first time, we were able to talk. And he had tears in his eyes just explaining what had happened and how for the first time, as his father was approaching death, there was reconciliation. In fact, one of the extraordinary things is that a person who is dying has a kind of relational authority. If you are dying, you can say, you know what, I really would like my son, who's living in Australia, to come and see me because I'm dying and this is the last chance. And the chances are the son will come from Australia. You can't do that the rest of your life, but when you're dying, you can have a kind of relational authority. So here is a wonderful opportunity for actually healing of relationships. And that's what Cicely Saunders realized, that dying well is not just all doom and gloom. Actually, it can be the most amazing opportunity. Amazing, a kind of weird and wonderful kind of adventure. That's what I have witnessed on many, many occasions. And being part of that journey, seeing how people find ways of fulfilling dreams, of growing spiritually and internally, of just being thankful. You know, one of the extraordinary things is when you're dying, for many people, there's a new gratitude for life. Often it's just the little things. You know, just watching a flower, seeing a bird. The little things which the rest of our lives we don't notice. Suddenly, these things become amazingly significant. And we want to give thanks. We want to have gratitude. For healing and building, or maybe completing relationships. You know, I think there's sometimes a sense of saying goodbye. This is why it's actually too important to plan for how you want to die. I know of people, for instance, who've written letters to all their loved ones and sealed them, ready to be sent when they're dying, saying those things which you can't say normally, face to face. But now here's an opportunity. Finding forgiveness. I'll just read you very briefly a story out of, I'm coming to the end, but just very briefly I'll read you this story which is in this book. It's a true life story. The daughter of the lady concerned told me in detail this story. So her mother, whom I'll call Mary, was diagnosed with a very advanced form of cancer. She'd experienced a life of broken relationships, and her daughter, who was my friend, described her as an intensely angry person with a sharp and destructive tongue. And her daughter had found faith in Christ when she was a student, but her mother had always totally held, I don't want any of that religion stuff. I don't, just held it away at bay. But then came the sudden news that the mother had advanced cancer and only weeks to live. And her daughter described how she was sitting in the outpatient department, in the radiotherapy department. So you can imagine sitting in those seats, waiting to go in and see the doctor. You know what it's like in a sort of hospital. There's sort of general turmoil going on. And her mother turns to the daughter and says, I've just got 3 questions. How can I forgive? How can I be forgiven? And what is heaven like? And her daughter, sitting in the outpatient department, tries to talk and listen. Why do you say that? It turned out that her mother had been abused as a child. She had no idea. That's why her first question is, how can I forgive? And Mary talked about the shame, the hurt, the hatred, and the anger that had dominated her life. And Mary's daughter gently shared about the person of Christ and his forgiveness, the fact that she could be wiped clean, and that heaven was a place of safety. And from that time in the outpatient department, Mary's life was changed. This is what she said: my mum was remade 2 weeks before she died. I've never seen anything more radical in my life. She was admitted to the local nursing home, and in the place of bitterness and resentment, there was thankfulness. Her daughter remembers Mary's gratitude when she received a plate of pureed vegetables. Mary said, "I can't believe how kind you all are to me." And the nurses said, "What a wonderful lady. She was so gentle, so loving, so caring." And that's not my mother. Now that's an extreme case, but it just shows you what dying well, the power of dying well. So as I close, God's plan for this age is not to abolish suffering, it's to redeem it. It's to bring blessing and healing and life out of the most difficult, painful, sometimes unimaginable experiences. We can't sanitize it, we can't wish it away, but I hope I can persuade you there is hope. There is, and it's not just pie in the sky, it's something I've witnessed so many times. The Bible says that God is going to abolish suffering, but it's not going to be in this age. Eventually, in the new heaven and the new earth, there will be that time when no more pain, no more suffering, no more loss. But for now, God's plan is to redeem suffering. And for those of us who are there supporting, our job is to be the presence. I love this quote which says, "Suffering is not a question which demands an answer. It's not a problem which demands a solution. It's a mystery which demands a presence." And we are called not to explain away suffering, not to make it go away. We are called to be the presence with the people who are suffering. And may God help us to be that presence. Thank you.
John, thank you very much indeed. We're going to have a break for about 5 minutes now. You might like to turn to your neighbour, decide if you've got a question you want to ask, put it on the Slido app, or in a few minutes raise a hand. But a short break. We'll be back. 5 minutes. Okay, well, we've had over 40 questions, so we can't possibly answer them all. But we will do our best to answer a good number of them. So the first one, with 21 votes, is there an ethical difference between passive euthanasia, withholding life support, and active euthanasia, administering a lethal dose?
Yes. The short answer is yes, there's a very important difference. And in fact, medical ethicists have basically agreed across the world that we shouldn't use this term, passive euthanasia, because it is just too confusing. So in fact, euthanasia now always means intentional killing. So as I said earlier, it's always been part of good medical practice to withhold and withdraw treatment that is bringing no benefit. The best way we think about it, the way I teach medical students and junior doctors, is all medical treatments are supposed to do good things, but they also have side effects and risks. They do bad things. All treatments do, all drugs do. And the whole art of medicine is to make sure that the good things your treatment is doing outweigh the bad things. And as long as your treatment is doing more good than bad, it's a good treatment. But unfortunately, very often in hospital medicine, it turns out that the bad things that the treatment is doing is much worse than the good. And in that situation, it's absolutely clear that the right thing to do is stop the treatment, because the treatment is doing damage. In fact, at its worst, it's a kind of medical abuse. The tragedy is that that kind of medical overtreatment is very, very common in the NHS. There are many, many people, even tonight, in an NHS hospital, and they are receiving futile, burdensome treatment, and for some bizarre reason, we can't stop it. And actually, why is this happening? It's happening because I know as a doctor, it's much harder to stop treatment than it is to keep it going. To keep the treatment going is something that's relatively straightforward. We say, oh well, carry on another day, why not? You never know. Well, let's start some more antibiotics. That's easy. The difficult treatment is to say, you know what, I'm absolutely convinced we should stop the treatment. What? Stop the treatment? And many times in my career as a consultant, I was called in to the intensive care unit to see particularly a baby or a very young child. And I had to say, stop. We must stop this treatment. It's doing harm. So withdrawing damaging, futile, pointless treatment is good medical practice, and it always has been. But that's completely different from introducing death, from deliberately killing. Another way of illustrating the difference is, many times in my career, I have been fighting against death. I've been there in the intensive unit. Sometimes I've been spending the whole night desperately trying to keep death away from this little being in the incubator. And yet sometimes there's the time to take away your hands and allow death to occur, because there's nothing that can be done. But when the death happens like that, I haven't caused it. I've allowed, death was already there. I've allowed it to happen. But what is being proposed is that we introduce death. We take a patient who isn't dying, we take the medicine and we kill them, or we help them to kill themselves. That's different. That is to introduce death. And that's what we now call euthanasia or assisted suicide.
John, thank you. Second most popular question. What do you think will be the effect on our palliative care services if the assisted dying bill is passed?
Well, this is a matter of deep concern. As I said, our palliative care services are the best in the world, but they are still very massively underfunded. And it's something that, to me, is deeply traumatizing and puzzling, because I cannot understand why The NHS is spending literally millions and millions and millions, sometimes billions of pounds on treatment, on incredibly rare, sophisticated treatments, which might only keep somebody with cancer alive an extra few weeks. And yet we're not prepared to spend anything like that sort of money on helping everybody to die well. And you know why this is happening? It's because, I'm afraid to say, it's you, the great public, the British public, because you, the British public, are absolutely outraged if you can't get every possible treatment for cancer, however expensive it is and however little the chance is going to help. So you put all the political pressure, the public puts all the political pressure on the politicians to improve treatment for rare conditions and sometimes incredibly expensive treatments. But you, the great British public, don't put much pressure on the politicians for improving the care of the dying. And in a democracy, that's how it works. So, as I said, there is a real fear that once money is going into assisted suicide and euthanasia, that the money that could have gone into palliative care will instead be diverted. And sadly, what we've seen in other countries, particularly in Canada, which have legalized this kind of euthanasia, is the kind of corruption of palliative care, where now in Canada, most palliative care services are actually doing euthanasia as well. So you can go into a palliative care facility, and if you want, you can have palliative care, but if you want, we'll kill you. You can pay your money and take your choice. And I think there's a great fear that there's going to be a lot of pressure on the hospices, many of which have a Christian or religious background, for them to start also being involved in assisted suicide and euthanasia.
So that leads on to this question. Assisted dying stats in countries like Canada and Belgium are extremely alarming. How can the UK try and safeguard thousands of vulnerable people against this slippery slope? So I guess that's more of a question about what can we do at this stage of the process, that sort of thing.
And the problem is that around the world, nobody has found a legal mechanism for protecting vulnerable people and protecting what's often called the slippery slope, preventing things slowly extending. And the reasons are because it is so arbitrary. You know, what's special about having 6 months to live? Why not 9 months? Why not a year? What's special about someone who's 18, more than 18? What about someone who's 17? What about someone who's 16 or 15? What's special about having normal mental capacity? I mean, psychiatric conditions cause a lot of suffering. Why shouldn't people like them have the right? What's special about people who don't have the capacity to consent? They could be suffering. Surely we should kill them, and so on. How do we prevent coercion? How do we detect it? How do we monitor it? How do we stop vulnerable people being abused? I'm afraid, I mean, with the best will in the world, it just isn't possible to create watertight safeguards. So then the question is, are we prepared to tolerate the fact that a significant number of people will be killed wrongly in order to allow other people who are desperate to have the right to kill themselves, to have their rights fulfilled? You know, in a society, we frequently accept limitations on our own freedom for the good of other people. You know, it was outrageous. I drove from London. You know, on numerous occasions, the speed at which I could drive was actually being restricted. It was completely outrageous. I've got a car that will do over 100 miles an hour, and yet I wasn't allowed to do it. What's more, I had to drive on the left-hand side of the road. I mean, how ridiculous. I mean, my autonomy was being constantly thwarted. Why was it? Because we recognize that sometimes my own choices and autonomy has to be limited for the good of other vulnerable people. And so if we have to ask some people who are desperate to have the right to kill themselves to say, you know what, because there are so many other vulnerable people, as a country, as a law, we cannot give you that freedom in order to protect the others. I think that makes logical sense.
Thank you, John. Why do we alleviate the sufferings of animals that cannot be treated while allowing humans to endure suffering?
Well, it's an obvious argument, isn't it? We put our dogs out of their misery. Why don't we do it to human beings? Answer: they're not dogs. That's the whole point. But I think a deeper answer is, as I try to explain, what is the cause of the suffering? When a dog is being put out of its misery, it's being put out of its misery because there is physical pain. And to be honest, the answer is, the reason we're doing that for a dog is that we don't want to spend thousands of pounds providing really excellent palliative care. We could do, but we don't, because it's a dog. But when it's a human being who is suffering, we can spend thousands of pounds to cure the physical pain, but what about all the other pain? Is the best solution for their psychological, their relational, their spiritual agony, is the best solution just off you go? Is that really compassionate? Is that really loving? I'm absolutely convinced it isn't. I'm absolutely convinced that treating the suffering, helping people to find healing in these different ways, psychological, relational, spiritual, is actually a much better way. It's much better for the person than just off you go.
Related to some extent, what evidence is there of a person's spirit departing at death?
That's a really good question. I mean, there were interesting experiments when people tried to weigh the body just before death using very sophisticated electronic balancers, and then just after death, so you could work out how much the soul was in terms of grams. But you won't be surprised to discover that it appeared there wasn't any difference in how much the body weighed immediately before and after death. So I think one of the sadnesses that so few people have watched people die is that you miss out on this extraordinary moment when someone passes from life and from this form of life into eternity. And it is actually quite common for there to be some remarkable incidents. Sometimes people say things or seem to be seeing things or watching things. Not always, it's very much individual. But that's why the whole tradition of the last words, what were someone's last words, that's why it grew, because the theory was, as people were approaching the mystery of the gateway into eternity, that they were sometimes gifted a glimpse into the future. And why you needed to be round with your notebook ready to capture the last words were because you might capture something, some glimpse into the future. And certainly I have witnessed myself, and I have heard other people talk about really quite astonishing things which have persuaded them that there was more to being a human being than just a body that goes into the grave. That actually there is something that goes beyond, that death cannot destroy, and which is part of our personhood. What the Christian faith teaches is that the human person has both a material, physical, and an immaterial, invisible part, and that in our life here, these two parts are inextricably intertwined, so much so that you simply cannot separate the material, physical, from the immaterial. But at death, in some strange way, they come apart. The body goes into the ground. The immaterial remains, But what the Christian faith teaches is something even more wonderful and even bizarre, and that is that in the new heaven and the new earth, the physical will be raised and reunited. So that we will be, the physical and the immaterial will be reunited in the new heaven and the new earth. And that's the mystery of being human. That's the good news of faith in Jesus. So you've never met an ordinary person. Every person you've ever booked, every person you've looked into the eyes of is a being of extraordinary significance and wonder and eternal destination.
Right, I think we might have a few questions from the floor. Jack, are you prepared to go around with the microphone? Where is Jack? There. Oh, Charlotte's going to. Ray, stick up a hand if you'd like to ask a question. One over there.
Hello. It's not so much a question, but I have worked as palliative care nurse and end-of-life care nurse for all of my career. And I'd just like to concur with everything that John has said and all the observations. I have seen so many families come into hospital, hospice, or visiting them at home in profound distress, and that's incredibly hard. And there have been times when they have begged to have something to end their lives. And I was very thankful every time that I was able to say, I'm not able to do that for you, but the team that you have come to be under the care of will support you. And within a few days, I have seen transformed families where not only is the pain be relieved, but the distress you were speaking of, relational, spiritual, psychological, has begun to be met. The patient feels safe, the families feel safe. They feel that people can be with them at this time. I think they often can't imagine it's possible that people can care for them, particularly strangers can actually give them this care. And that's the privilege of the palliative care movement. And I've also seen many people say, I had no idea that this sort of care existed. I'm so thankful that they've had that care, and I just wish more people in society could know that. Thank you.
Much, yeah. Well, thank you.
Mine's merely an observation. When my mother was dying in a care home, I went to her. I'd come down from Northampton, and I just held her hand all the time, and I told her, Jesus loves you. And I've been told that the last thing that goes is your hearing, so she would have known that. And then when my sister was dying, she was in palliative care in Windsor, and actually I didn't get there in time to see her before she died. I saw her when she had died, but they were so good, the staff. They said, well, Juliet is laid out with her head towards the door and so on, and it was just so beautiful what they did, for me to be able to be with her, even though she had died, and they laid her out beautifully.
Thank you very much. I think what you say is absolutely right. The two senses which remain to the end is hearing and touch. And so it's very important, if you are at the bedside of someone, that you remember that you remember that they could be hearing what you're saying, even if they seem unresponsive, and that you cuddle them, that you hold their hand, you put an arm around them, and that you reassure them that you're there. The greatest fear that people have is of dying alone, of being abandoned. And therefore, just to be able to reassure that we are going to stay with you, we're going to walk with you to the end, when no one is leaving, you can know that we're going to be here right to the end, is a huge reassurance.
And one here at the front.
Hi, thank thank you. I've really enjoyed your talk today. It's been very thought-provoking. So my name is Laura and I'm an occupational therapist and I work with dementia services. And I suppose my question is, that idea of doctors can make the decision to withhold treatment, but they don't. And I have seen the outworking of that, especially working in dementia. People who obviously became very unwell with the pneumonia, which used to be the old man's gift, wasn't it? The way of exiting life, are brought back after 4 or 5 weeks on assisted oxygen and now can no longer function, end up in care that they never wanted. And so I'm just wondering about, because that's why I'm kind of thinking, oh, this is a good thing, to enable people to have more choice around accepting medication, accepting treatment, rather than the actual killing somebody. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's kind of, how do we stop this carrying on? How do we enable doctors to feel supported, to go, no, enough's enough? Because I've also heard, the person didn't want it, and the family was saying, don't do it, and it still continued.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. And that is, unfortunately, all too common. But there is a response. There is a way to prevent it happening. And that is to create an LPA, a lasting power of attorney. And basically, my appeal to you is that everybody, certainly everybody beyond the age of 50, should nominate one or more people to be a lasting power of attorney. You can go through the process. It's very easy to do it now. You can do it online. You don't need to have a lawyer. You can do the whole thing online. And basically what you are doing is you are giving actually an extraordinary amount of legal power to another human being to make decisions. There are 2 types of LPA. There's LPA which deals with financial affairs, and there's LPA which deals with health and welfare. And I recommend you do both. But the most important thing is that you trust absolutely and implicitly the person you are giving this power to, because I'm afraid there have been terrible abuses by people who weren't trustworthy. But my wife and I, we have given LPA to our 3 boys, for good or ill, and we have told them also what we want. And if in that situation, if there is, it doesn't have to be a relative, it just has to be somebody with an LPA, they have the legal power to say, you must not treat this person. And the doctors would have, if necessary, you can take them to court. And the doctors would have to have a very strong reason to prove you were not acting in the person's best interests. So, in other words, provided you plan ahead and provided you make your wishes clear, the LPA actually is a very strong legal way of preventing this kind of madness, of medical madness.
Good. I think we need to move on. So some questions with a bit more pushback now, John. Is it not a problematic generalisation to consider anybody pro-assisted dying to be an ageing elitist control freak?
Okay, it was a caricature. But nonetheless, it's remarkably how common it is. I mean, you will have seen the public debates. You will have seen the people who have been in the media, and they tend to be elderly. They tend to be either celebs or senior professionals or politicians. We haven't heard many people, the ordinary people, clamoring for, I mean, most people are not desperately wishing to exert their will. Most people are just trying to survive. Most people are just trying to get to the end of the week and deal with all the problems and struggles of everyday life.
Is the 80% who want this apparently, is it just because they're influenced by these people?
I think they are, and I think a lot of the public have, to be honest, have very little clue about what they are voting for. I suspect that some people here, it's been a bit of a wake-up call as to what is being proposed. And it's been shown that if you change the wording, and if you say, do you think the law should be changed so that a doctor is capable of prescribing lethal poisons to someone who wishes to end their own life, suddenly the percent plummets. So exactly how you word the question makes a big difference to, which is why you should treat these public polls with a great deal of suspicion, because they're not really reliable.
You spoke of dying well about making peace, fixing relationships, etc. What about people who've done all that? Should they be allowed to die as they want?
Well, the truth is there are a small group of people who are absolutely determined that they wish to end their lives. And the truth is there's nothing stopping them. It's not illegal to take lethal poisons. There are many ways, sadly, of people wanting to kill themselves. So what they are demanding is not the right to kill myself, because they already have that right. What they are demanding is that a professional, a whole system be set up to enable them to be killed in the way they want. And that's the question. Should we... Yes, there are a small number of people who desperately want to kill themselves. The question is, should we change the law for everybody across, for all 500,000 people who are dying every year? Should we change the law which is going to affect everybody in order to meet the needs of these small numbers? I mean, the truth is, there are people like that quite frequently go to Switzerland, to Dignitas, or to other clinics to commit suicide. But I told you there are 500,000 a year people dying. How many people from England go to Dignitas? And the answer is between 50 and 100. So do we want to change the law for 500,000 people because of the 50 to 100 people a year who want to kill themselves?
Is preventing someone from having a peaceful death due to your own discomfort around the issue not also selfish?
Well, it's sometimes said that, doctors like me who are opposing this, we're just heartless bigots. We just want to watch people suffer. I hope I haven't given you that impression. If I have, please forgive me. I mean, as you heard from the lady who talked from personal experience of palliative care, it's not about forcing people to be suffered. Quite the reverse. What we are offering through palliative care is the most effective and powerful form of care that treats people, that addresses the suffering directly. So it isn't a question of a sort of heartless and cruel professionals. Quite the reverse. The tragedy is, to be honest, is that only 10% or less of people in this country actually die in a hospice. Most people die on a general NHS ward, surrounded by people who, frankly, are incompetent when it comes to caring for the dying. I mean, it's an outrage, but, doctors are not taught how to care for dying people. Medical students aren't taught. Nurses are not taught. It's not part of standard medical training. We're taught how to do resuscitation. We're taught how to do cardiac massage. But when it comes to caring for dying people, it's a specialist thing, which is just for... So the outrage to me is that so many people are dying badly in the UK when they don't need to. When, if we could make the kind of excellent palliative care which you've heard described, if we could make that available to everybody across the NHS, it would transform people's experience of the end of life. But it doesn't come cheap. It requires resources, it requires expertise, and it requires a whole system of ensuring that everybody receives the very best care.
So, coming into land, but I've lost the question now. What should we do as a result of this now? Should we try and stop this law going through? Is there any practical action that we can take if we are opposed to this?
Well, one of the wonderful privileges we have in a democracy, and that is you have the right to contact your MP. And this is something you really could do between now and the end of April. The final vote on this bill is going to be taken by every MP at the end of April, we think. And every one of you here has your own constituency MP, and you could contact your MP and explain briefly, in a few sentences, why you don't think you want them to vote against this law. And ask them, I'm asking you, please, as a constituent, to vote against this law and vote against this bill and prevent it becoming law. You can find your own MP online. You can do it on the government website. I think it's Parliament website. There's another one called They Work For You. And you can put in your postcode, find her your MP, and you can email them. And so that's something practical you could do. I wrote a report on this before the last vote and arranged for it to be printed and sent to every single MP. So this is the great thing about democracy. We have the right to influence our MPs. They're going to make the vote. If you are persuaded that this is not a good way to go, could you please contact your MP?
When we were talking about this when we were planning this session, you said that if it goes through, we'll need a different sort of tactic. What were you thinking about?
Yes, I'm part of a group that has already started to discuss how we would respond if the bill was passed and how we would start to create a resistance movement. The really sad thing to me is that as I look around the world, wherever euthanasia in some form has been legalized, the opposition has just sort of rolled over and accepted it as a fait accompli. And I believe there is such strength and depth of resistance here in the UK that we can actually mount a very serious resistance movement. And I think this will be partly trying to protect the hospices, trying to protect the right of conscience for health professionals, and even trying to create facilities, euthanasia-free facilities, either within the NHS or even possibly outside the NHS, that are safe places both for patients and for doctors. And the interesting thing is that in many other countries across the world, even though euthanasia has been legalized, it hasn't spread into the hospital system. And the reason for that is that many of the hospitals are independent, and many of them have a religious foundation. And these independent religious hospitals, many of them Christian hospitals, say, we don't want to have anything to do with it. We refuse to participate. That used to be the case here in the UK. There were many proud independent Christian hospitals. But in the formation of the NHS, every single hospital, virtually, every single of the big Christian hospitals became part of a state system. And now we're all under the control of the state. And we're not free to do what we think is right. And I think it's possible that if a law like this gets legalized, it would start a train of actually starting to reinvent independent Christian healthcare facilities and a place where doctors like me and others and nurses and health practitioners can work in a way which is in accordance with our beliefs. And what's more, I suspect that if ever those independent health facilities were created, the great British public will beat a path to the door because they're not stupid and they know where they will get the best care.
John, just a final, more personal questions. Sir, you specialise in the first stirrings, life's beginning. Please share how you came as a neonatal specialist to devote yourself to our final moments.
It's a good question. So there are lots of similarities, between one end of life and the other. I had the enormous privilege of being a personal friend and personal physician to the great John Stott, who was a very distinguished Christian pastor. And we used to joke about it because he would ask me some deeply personal medical question. And I would say, well, what do I know? I'm a baby doctor. I'm very good at nappy rash. And he would say, I hope it hasn't come to that yet, dear brother. But the truth is that nappy rash can affect us at both ends of life. So there are similarities, and my involvement in medical ethics and trying to engage in these topics are because human life is precious from first breath to final end, and it's a privilege to be part of that. Could I mention also some books? Can I have a book plug?
Have a book plug, yes.
Sorry. A couple of books. Forgive the plug. One of the things that John Stott used to say, you must remember, dear brother, don't never promote yourself. So here I am. Right to Die, question mark, is if you want to follow the medical ethics, the arguments in favour of euthanasia and palliative care, this is the book which particularly deals with that. And then this second book, Dying Well, is a much more personal book dealing with what does it mean to die well, and this is particularly either for some, if you know that you yourself are coming to the end of your life, here this book is addressed for you. What does it mean to die well? Or if you know someone, there's a section at the end which is really for carers and supporters of people, someone who's dying, of how can I support someone as they come to the end of their life. So they're both at the end, they're £5 each. Thanks very much.
We don't have huge quantities, so you'll have to rush to get the books. John, we are incredibly grateful to you for giving us an hour and a half of incredibly rich medical thought, theological thought, ethical thought, philosophical thought. It's come from a lifetime, I know, of being a Christian doctor, and we are hugely, hugely grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, John, just such wisdom and compassion. I'm sure it's provoked lots of questions as well as answered lots of questions. So thank you so much. At Rethink, we're trying to be brave and tackle issues that are right out there in the public domain. And we're switching to this issue next. We're inviting Ed Shaw, who's one of the directors of a charity called Living Out that engages in conversations around sexuality, identity and faith. He's a pastor and author in Bristol, and we're going to talk about a book he's written called The Intimacy Deficit, and how the world that we see out there is full of shallow, fleeting relationships, and people are expressing their sexuality in lots of different ways in a desire, as I think the old Rolling Stones song says, I can't get no satisfaction. And people are finding the emptiness of relationships. But yet there's a deficit. Well, how do we build honest, true, faithful relationships that deal with that? So Ed's still thinking. We've sort of finalized it today. I think it's going to be really thought-provoking, quite challenging. It's a different sort of issue. The QR code will take you to Eventbrite. The reason we use Eventbrite is because we want you to come whether you're a churchgoer or not. We want it to be something that's safe to go to. So that is happening here on the 30th of April. So 2 months. So we do two in this time, and then we have a gap in the summer and Christmas. So a couple of months. We'd love to see you all again. Let me get that email from Eventbrite. You have loads of returning customers. So Richard and St Matthews, thank you very much, and John, once again, thank you so much.
Can I just reiterate what I said at the beginning, that if there are personal issues that have come up which you'd like help and support with, please come and ask us. And what was the last thing I was going to say? I can't remember what I was going to say. It's been lovely having you here tonight. Thank you very much.